Welcome everyone to our session today. We are members of Rotaract, and we are going to be sharing an introduction to diversity, equity, and inclusion with you today as it relates to our Rotary and Rotaract clubs. So we always like to start with a land acknowledgement. So that's how I'd like to open our training today, by sharing a land acknowledgement for the land that I am currently residing on. So the University of Toronto operates on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I'm grateful to live, work, and study on this land. So what is a land acknowledgement, and why do we do them, especially at the beginning of meetings? The sharing of a land acknowledgement supports one of Rotary's cornerstones as a humanitarian organization of building sustainable peace in communities throughout the world. It is shared at the beginning of all meetings to remind us of our responsibilities to the land and express gratitude to those who reside on this land. It's an integral part of reconciliation that involves making a statement recognizing the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples prior to settler arrival. We encourage folks to do a land acknowledgement at the very start of all gatherings. The host of the meeting may personalize the statement to the land on which they reside and talk about their personal relationship to the land, as I did. District 7090 has provided a suggested template for Rotary clubs to utilize. You can check the website Native Land to locate and learn more about the traditional territory on which you reside to personalize the statement. So that's what we have up on the slide here today, is the suggested template for all Rotary clubs to use in their meetings. And we also included a link to the website to learn more about the territory on which you reside. Now we're going to introduce ourselves. So my name is Victoria. I use the pronouns she, her. I'm part of the district Rotaract committee as the Minister of Internal Affairs, and I'm also a general member of the Niagara Region Rotaract Club.
So I'm Lorraine. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the treasurer of the Niagara Region Rotaract Club.
My name is Ronnie. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm a member of the Niagara Region Rotaract Club.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sophia. My pronouns are she, her. I go to McMaster in Hamilton, and I'm kind of figuring out which club I'm involved in. I think I could call myself like a Niagara member, I guess, but yeah, I'm figuring it out.
And I'm now going to pass it off to Lorraine to discuss our agenda for today's meeting.
Thank you so much. So here's the agenda for today's training session. First, we will provide a brief overview of 6 topics, and then discuss how DEI can continue to be implemented into clubs. We will have a couple of breaks for activities and guest speakers, and as well as to support folks in digesting the information, answering any questions, and going from there.
So our learning objectives for today. Today we have 3 learning objectives. First off is to deepen our understanding and knowledge of what diversity, equity, and inclusion are. Secondary, to deepen our understanding and knowledge of key DEI issues, including land acknowledgements, which we discussed previously, and the use of pronouns, gender identity, sexual orientation, and equality, touching on the topics of ageism, sexism, and racism. And 3, to gather knowledge and tangible action items to bring to and implement in your clubs and other clubs.
Okay, so the next thing we're just gonna go through is the group agreement. So we would like to establish some just general rules of thumb for the meeting. First, we would ask that you keep an open mind and heart, as we are all entering the space with different backgrounds, life experiences, and knowledge. We want to be inclusive and respectful of everyone's perspective. And next, we want to establish an understanding that feeling any emotion, such as guilt or being uncomfortable, is a part of the learning process, but not the goal of the session. So Remember to express kindness to yourself and to others as we support one another in our learning journeys. And lastly, and importantly, we ask that you make an active commitment to continuing to learn and advance the principles of DEI in our clubs. So these are some of the rules. So in order for our speakers to deliver all the necessary information and address all of your questions as effectively and smoothly as possible, we kindly ask that you type your questions in the chat or raise your hand using the Zoom raise hand function. And please do not unmute and speak during the presentations, just as we'll take a pause and invite questions at that time and go from there.
So we're going to start off with some definitions. We'd like to establish a common understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And while these terms can be defined and understood in several ways, depending on what resource you're using, we chose to align with Rotary International's definitions. So Rotary International's definition for diversity includes people of all backgrounds, experiences, and identities, regardless of their age, ethnicity, race, color, abilities, religion, socioeconomic status, culture, sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Equity, carefully considering how to provide different levels of support, opportunities, and resources so participants from all different backgrounds have a welcoming and productive experience. And inclusion, to create experiences in which all people, no matter their ethnicity, their abilities, pretty much everything that was stated within the diversity definition, are welcomed and respected and valued. So there is a small quote there at the bottom. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And with these three definitions, we will be able to expand more upon the other topics. So next, we wanted to share Rotary International's official statement on our commitment to DEI. This demonstrates the call to action from our organization to actively commit to integrating these principles into our clubs and lives as Rotarians and Rotaractors. This will also be put into the resources at the very end of the presentation. The presentation is going to be sent out to everybody, so you can go through this as well on your own time, basically give it a small little read through, just to kind of see where Rotary stands in terms of implementing everything into the clubs that we participate in. So our first topic for today. Previously, you have heard us introducing ourselves with pronouns, she, her, she, they. We're now going to discuss why we did that and what it means. So a pronoun is a word that refers to either the person talking to you, I or you, or someone or something that is being talked about, she, it, them, this. If you've ever taken another language course, you'll know how important learning those pronouns are, especially with French or Spanish, it depends. And gender pronouns, he, she, they, ze, etc., are specific to the person you are referring to. So in summary, pronouns are words we use to refer to someone in place of their name. So why do people use non-traditional pronouns sometimes? Sometimes people are looking for pronouns that acknowledge their existence outside of the traditional gender binary, which he, him, she, her, etc. We're all different. It's okay if our pronouns are biological sex, our gender identity and gender expression, sexual orientation. It's okay if they don't necessarily match up in traditional ways. All of these variables are independent of each other, and together they combine to allow a person to express themselves in whatever way they feel best fits. For example, a person may be assigned the sex of female at birth, but use they them pronouns because they don't feel that the traditional she, her match their identity. From personal experience, I've been using and kind of experimenting with they them pronouns for the last several years because it feels just a bit more right with how I see myself and my own gender identity. And that's okay. Pronouns can change and that's all right. So Sophia is also going to be talking a bit more about the differences between all of these terms later, as well as how we can affirm on someone's pronouns. So if you'd like, we could switch off to her.
Okay, thank you, Ronnie, for sharing that example. So a really common question that a lot of people have is, how can I affirm somebody's pronouns? And affirm just means like validating their pronouns. The most important thing with this question is that you just try your best to affirm somebody's pronouns, which all of you are doing a fantastic job of by just showing up and being here today and trying to educate yourselves. So first, when we go about affirming somebody's pronouns, we can start with just asking them what their pronouns are. So like in an introduction, you would just say, hey, my name is Sophia and my pronouns are she, her. What's your name and your pronouns? Very simple. Next, navigating pronouns can be kind of difficult for a person, or maybe a little bit confusing, or it might take some time to figure it out, as Ronnie had explained in their example, and they might change over time. So make sure to check in with that person every once in a while to ensure you're using their correct pronoun set. Third, practice using their pronouns in your natural conversations. So both directly speaking with them and then when indirectly speaking about them. And lastly, this one's very important. Make sure not to over apologize if you make any mistakes with your pronouns. If somebody uses they, them, and you refer to them as like he or she, just say, sorry, that was my bad, and then correct yourself and move on. The best thing you can do is apologize, ask them if you need any clarification, and then just try to remember the next time. Okay, so let's recall that pronouns are independent of biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. A person's gender identity is described as their experience of their own gender. So remember when Ronnie told us that a person's preferred pronouns might be different from their biological sex assigned at birth? So that sounds, all of this sounds kind of wordy, and traditionally a lot of these terms might have been used interchangeably. However, like we said, they are independent of each other. So I'll go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into the differences between them, just to help your understanding of them a little bit. So first we have sex versus gender. So our biological sex is just whether we're assigned male, female, or intersex at birth. It's usually assigned by a doctor when we're little babies and just based on simply physical characteristics. Then we have gender, which a lot of people might think that it can be used interchangeably with sex. Actually, though, gender is a completely different thing, because regardless of somebody's sex that they're assigned at birth, gender is a person's own experience of their identity. And most importantly, you cannot determine someone's gender just by looking at them. And you should never treat somebody differently or poorly just because they identify their gender in a certain way. Secondly, we have gender expression versus perception. For the sake of time, I won't dive too much deeper into these terms, but a fantastic resource that you can go ahead and check out on your own is something called the Trevor Project's Guide to Being an Ally for Transgender and Non-Binary Youth. And we have a whole page at the end full of great resources that you can do your own research on after this presentation. So you'll be able to find this link there. Okay, so far we've covered pronouns. We've considered how they relate to a person's biological sex versus their gender identity. And next we'll cover the topic of sexuality, which encompasses sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is a term that regards to who you're attracted to. It can be sexually or romantically. So for example, sexual orientation includes these terms on the right here, such as heterosexual, gay, straight, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, queer, questioning. And below there, again, is another great resources for those terms if you want to do some reading up on them for some more clarification on what they each mean. What's important is that we keep in mind that sexuality is a spectrum, and therefore we do not have to force labels upon anyone about their sexuality if they don't want one. However, if a person is confident in outwardly sharing their label of sexual orientation, make sure to validate it. And just like we don't assume someone's gender or pronouns based on their external characteristics, we're making sure that we're not going to assume someone's sexuality based on these things either. And next, Lorena is going to guide us through our little question break.
Thank you so much. So we will now be taking a short 5-minute break just to answer some questions. You can put your questions in the chat or use the hand raise function in the Zoom, and all of us in the group will take turns answering questions. Okay.
It seems we're going to be at least 5 minutes ahead of schedule.
Which is great. Oh, I see somebody's raised their hand.
Sure.
Go
I
ahead,
think
Avery.
I think your presentation was really good. So I think, you described everything really well. I found a resource online, and it was a really good graphic of a whole bunch of different definitions. And I found that really helpful. So I think I'm looking forward to getting the presentation and clicking through to your resources to see and learn a little bit more. And I really appreciate it, because I've been hesitant to put my pronouns in because I'm of a generation where it's like, why bother? And so to hear that it's a little bit more, I don't know, I found it really helpful, I guess, is all I want to say.
Thank you. Happy to hear. And again, any questions you have at all, feel free to reach out to us, send us an email, whatever it is, and we'll be happy to try and help out however we can.
Rebecca's
have a
got
basic question. Oh,
Sorry, I just want to pitch in to Avery, talking about your generation not like being like, what's the point? The point is, we kind of talked about like inclusion, that by having your pronouns there, it shows that maybe someone who comes in who does identify as they, them, or, something, as Ronnie was saying, outside of the traditional, they then feel comfortable that, and they know that it's an inclusive environment where the people will like respect and their pronouns. So that's kind of, because I've had that before where I've had to explain that. So I just want to jump in.
Thank you.
If I
Dave?
could just add on really quick to that. Sorry, I know Dave has a question. You're right, Rebecca. It's definitely, I know, at least in my experience, when people have used like their pronouns when introducing, or just in kind of, well, definitely within introducing, it's kind of like the easiest way to kind of put them in. It definitely opens up that space and kind of allows for more, I guess, a better like comfortable feeling in terms of if you use non-traditional pronouns. So no, I do agree with that.
Dave and then Sophia.
yeah, I just, I'm going on 74, and I had an English teacher in high school that said I was going to be useless unless I stuck to engineering and math. The point I'm saying is that this is all a lengthy generational change in my mind, because I have a very difficult time when Ronnie, you said she and they, whereas I take they as being sort of plural, and it's that possessive concept that you're trying to relate. So I have a difficulty when I read they and I'm going, what? Oh yes, maybe. So how do I? It's going to take me another lifetime almost to get rid of this impression that has been sort of branded into my mind about the English language.
No, I have heard that a lot as well. It's definitely, again, we've kind of grown up with hearing they as in reference to a group of people or as the plural. And it is something that it's kind of been ingrained almost, but through practice and through, I guess, presentations like this and just trying to keep a conscious mind about it, it does get easier over time. It really does.
I hope.
Sophia just had something to say as well. Sorry.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to add on to that. It does sound really unfamiliar to use they as like a non-plural term, but we actually do use it like all the time in our speech. We just don't recognize it. So like, for example, like somebody could say like, oh, whose computer is that? And you could say, oh, it's Ronnie's, like they left their computer at work, or oh, it's Sophia's, they left their computer at work. So it is used sometimes as a possessive. I think it just like takes that, like it's sometimes really conscious to be able to recognize it, and that can be difficult, but just taking your time with it, allowing for mistakes to happen, that's totally fine. I also just had another question, maybe Ronnie can help me out with this. Something that I have some trouble with sometimes is affirming somebody's pronouns who uses like she, they, or he, they, and knowing which one to refer to them as. Like, should I use he? Should I use they? Which one should I use? That's like the most affirming. Should I use them interchangeably, or should I stick to one or the other in certain situations? So maybe Ronnie, you could help me out with that one.
Yeah, of course. I know, at least in my personal experience, I kind of use she, they to make it a little bit easier for other people as well. So if they, again, like the whole thing about they is still a little bit, you know, like you refer to somebody as the plural, I don't really know how to use this in this context. At least that way, if I kind of give a pronoun as well that is a little bit more traditional, it kind of helps people start to think, I guess, along the lines of maybe moving from one to the other. But usually if somebody does give two different pronouns, they are okay with you using either one. It's not more so just like they have it there just because it's there. Like they will tell you because they are okay with you using either one, like I am. Like I'm okay. I know, especially like with the older members of my family, like my grandparents, they don't really understand anything like along the lines. To be fair, they're in their 90s, so it's a little bit hard for them to kind of wrap their heads around like the concepts of gender identity and stuff like that. So using she is a little bit easier for them to kind of understand. But definitely if somebody gives you two different pronouns, it's very much like you can use either one.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all the questions and for the answers. I think next we're going to go and move on to sexism. So Ronnie, I'll let you take that away.
Alrighty. So now, after this little question break, which has been quite lovely, again, thank you all for the questions. That was very nice. Now we're going to cover certain topics and concepts that are often used as grounds for discrimination in our current society. They were stated with the equity definition: sexism, ageism, and racism. And I will be talking a little bit about sexism. So we're going to talk about those three topics, how we can apply our EDI knowledge to resist them from being used as excuses that create exclusive environments, inequities, and stereotyping. So by definition, sexism is prejudice or discrimination based on one's sex or gender. Sexism can affect anyone, but it primarily affects women, girls, and non-binary individuals. A little bit of to recall, non-binary is those who don't exist within the gender of, the gender binary of men or woman. Sexism is typically linked to stereotype beliefs surrounding the fundamental nature of women and men, including non-binary individuals, transgender women, transgender men, etc., and the gendered roles each person is supposed to or should play in society. These sexist assumptions can manifest themselves as gender stereotypes. There are numerous little ones that, if you give it a moment of thought, you can probably think with a couple of examples, and they can end up ranking one's gender in superior to another or to others. So after those little definitions there, we're just going to talk very briefly about some sexism do's and don'ts. So don't assign certain gender activities, projects, etc. to certain genders. Be careful of the language that you use. I know the example that we have there, something that I'm sure many of us have heard even just back in the classroom. I need the strongest guys or the strongest boys in the room to help me carry some things inside. Maybe, I know we've all heard that, and I know at least for the people who identify as women, that can be kind of upsetting sometimes and a little bit, you know, it's like, I'm strong too, I can help too. So instead, assign equal opportunities, projects, tasks to any and all genders. Be ambiguous. Can I have 2 volunteers to help me bring something inside? People have different skill sets, and their abilities to do something shouldn't be constricted just because of the gender or the sexual, like the way that they present themselves. So don't base your entire opinion off of someone's gender and the traditional stereotypes that go with it. People are more than as they present themselves as. They are individuals with talents and skills and ideas, and how they present themselves doesn't necessarily reflect that. How they present themselves is simply how they want to present themselves. Instead, get to know people around you closely. Base your understanding off of them and off of real evidence. Talk to people. Get to know them, relate to them, see what they can do and where their talents lie. And that's kind of the little bit of the do's and don'ts there. And now we'll pass off to Sophia for ageism.
Thank you, Ronnie. That was so great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about ageism. Ageism is described as stereotyping, prejudice, and or discrimination against individuals or groups on the basis of their age. And ageism can work in the form of younger individuals stereotyping older individuals. That is a little bit more common, but it can work the other way around too. So for example, younger individuals might consider older individuals as less productive, or younger individuals might consider older ones as resistant to change. But the other way around, older individuals might consider younger ones as less respectable, less educated, or maybe less wise. I think I've had a few experiences with this myself. I think just because I'm young, people might not trust the opinions that I have to say or the thoughts that I have to say just because I'm a little bit younger, and they might assume that I'm like less experienced or less wise because of that. So that can be a tough one to deal with. So we can resist ageism by confronting our biases and stereotypes of individuals and their age, regardless of them being younger or older. So we must not assume that a person's age dictates their capabilities, intelligence, or experience. Just like Ronnie explained, we must not assume that person's sex or gender or sexual orientation or presentation dictates their capabilities, intelligence, etc. So when we show resistance to the generalizations that are made towards a specific generation of demographic of people, we can reduce the risk of discriminating individuals or groups based on this ground. And now Lorraine's going to talk to us a bit about racism.
Thank you so much. So I just want a little more background. So I identify as a female mixed young woman. So I'm going to go a little bit into racism, but just keep in mind that how I see it and how I've experienced it is solely based on my own experiences. So it's not something that you can apply to the whole group because my experience is just like everyone else's. It's all very different and specific to individuals. So on the screen, we have a definition that I found that I thought was suitable for my experience and understanding of what racism was in my experience. So I'm just going to read it off to you. So prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular race or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. So we talked a little bit earlier about different groups and how sometimes they are treated differently just because of the group they're in. So I'm going to go and, try and be a little specific in this. I don't want to get too much into detail about it, but I'm just going to base things off of my experience. So now that we have a definition of racism that fits my experiences, I just wanted to say something that we could do that could kind of help with this is to educate ourselves on the topic. So, looking at books, doing research, looking at magazines, all on your own and doing that research there. It's good to ask around as well with people that you know that are maybe a part of minority groups that have stated that they're comfortable talking about that. But we just have to keep in mind that we can't put their experiences over the whole group because it's very customized to themselves. So again, how we can do this, pulling up articles, reading books, going to the library, asking around, just doing as much research as we possibly can on our own. to get a wide perspective, wide range of examples and experiences that people have had to deal with racism, and kind of trying to put together a compilation of all of those experiences to kind of come to our own conclusions that work along with that. And I think the next slide is Victoria's. She's going to go into more detail about this with some definitions.
Thank you, Lorraine. So I just wanted to kind of touch on how racism can show up in different forms. So I wanted to mention anti-indigeneity or settler colonialism. So this is racism directed towards Indigenous folks. Anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness, which is racism directed towards Black folks, and anti-Asian racism. So for instance, we've seen an increase in racist incidents against Asian persons or persons who appear to be part of the Asian community after COVID-19. So it's important to kind of recognize the different ways that racism can be explicit as well as implicit in order to really ensure that we are committing ourselves to being anti-racist. And we are also identifying ways that racism is showing up in our communities, and we're able to kind of take action on that and ensure that it's not infiltrating our Rotary clubs, and also taking action when we do see incidences that happen within our clubs. So something that I also wanted to touch on, because of the ways that racism can be implicit, are microaggressions and bias. And these are things that also can show up against members of any marginalized groups. So groups that we spoke about earlier, for instance, the LGBTQ+ community, folks who have a different gender identity that's not dominant or common. We can kind of see these implicit or covert ways that prejudice can come about in our daily lives or in common places. So microaggressions are commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental slights, whether these are intentional or unintentional, that can kind of communicate hostility, can be derogatory, or can communicate a negative attitude towards a stigmatized or a culturally marginalized group. An example of this might be workplaces who have policies that say that Black women cannot wear their natural hair to work. That would be considered a microaggression. So it might not be an explicit act of physical violence, but it is still a racist act. And something that's important to note as well is bias. So bias is a disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing, usually in a way that is closed-minded, prejudicial, or unfair. So all of us hold biases, right? Just from the way that we were brought up, the generations that we grew up in, the cultures that we grew up in, our religion, our schooling, all of these can kind of educate us or provide us with knowledge that might contribute to biases that we hold. And these biases might be conscious or unconscious. So we might actually hold prejudice or bias that we're not even really consciously aware of. And that's why things like this DEI training today are so important, because the more that we educate ourselves, and this is actually shown in research as well, the more that folks educate themselves on these topics, the more that we can begin to examine our own personal biases and kind of unlearn these things. So a great example is something that David brought up before, right, about pronouns. You know, growing up in a generation where they meant plural. So this is something that David's identified as kind of a personal learning journey where, you know, they means plural, but this is something that I can work to unlearn. And this is something that now I see in this generation can be used in a different way. And that's something that, you know, David's expressed a commitment to unlearning. So we really appreciate that. And that's something that we really encourage all the folks here today to commit to and continue doing as well. And lastly, just to try to, you know, tie in some of these topics together and really kind of ensure that we're implementing DEI, we need to kind of understand these topics. So we have oppression or marginalization, power, privilege, and ally. So oppression can be thought of discrimination that is achieved by social means. So it's social exclusion, it's creating exclusive clubs where certain groups of individuals are not allowed membership or kind of not welcomed into these spaces. And it affects whole groups of people, and it's systemic. So it's actually built into the fabric of our society, which is why us as individuals need to kind of work together to unlearn these things and to kind of fight these systems. Power is an advantage that allows someone to gain capacity and have influence. So we all kind of hold positions of power within our lives, and we all might be marginalized in some spaces in our lives. So for instance, someone might hold a position of power within their workplace, but they might identify as part of a marginalized group. So we all kind of have to negotiate these different things in our lives where we have positions of power or we have positions of privilege, and we might also be oppressed or marginalized in other spaces in our lives. So with that, privilege is an advantage or a set of advantages. Oh, I'm sorry. That you've been granted that others may not have been granted. This privilege is given to you before you were even born based on your class, meaning your socioeconomic status, your race, your family structure, your gender, etc. And your privilege does not negate your efforts in life, but it has granted you an advantage. So all this means is that you may not have had to face the same obstacles or barriers as others have had to face based on characteristics such as race. And lastly, we have ally. So an ally is a person of one social identity group who publicly supports members of another group. So for instance, this might look like folks that are white supporting Black folks through movements like Black Lives Matter. So what's important here is that in order to implement DEI, we all act as allies in supporting groups of persons that we're not members of. And we also all recognize our positions of power and privilege, as well as ways in which we might be oppressed or recognizing groups that might be oppressed or marginalized, and how we can open up our clubs and our spaces to invite these groups in and make them feel welcome. For example, how Ronnie mentioned earlier about the use of pronouns, making our clubs more of a welcoming and open space for folks who might identify outside of a gender binary. And lastly, we kind of have a call back to our learning objectives, which is a commitment to action and continuing to learn, which is, I will not be perfect, I will keep learning. I will also not be silent, I will keep learning.
Okay, so now we're going to be running through a little bit of an activity. We're going to go through some breakout rooms. And this is the time where we can talk with each other about what's been discussed so far and then how the topics pertain to Rotary. So please feel free to ask questions and express your thoughts about the topics discussed and how they can be implemented in your clubs. I know we've thrown quite a bit of new information at you all today. Maybe it's new, maybe it's not. So if you don't have a lot of questions, that's totally okay. We do have some guided questions that we can go through, but feel free to ask any questions that you might have. Don't be nervous to ask us questions. It's all a learning experience.
Hi, folks. So as folks filter in, I'd love to continue the discussion for a few more minutes in the main room. Oh, hello. Great. Okay, I think we have everybody. So yeah, we can continue this discussion for a couple of more minutes in the main room. So did anybody want to continue speaking about their question or ask a new question in the whole group?
I know the reason that I'm here today is because our group is really concerned about implementation, which is something that I think our smaller group was talking about too. You know, we have a DEI committee, and we've started thinking about, we started doing assessments of our group. You know, what are the things that we're doing that are causing our group to feel hostile to people that aren't of a certain race or of a certain gender expression, or, you know, the different things that we're talking about today. But we're also cognizant that our group has some very traditional opinions, that we have a lot of people that have been in the group as it exists now for a long time, and they're resistant to changing it. So I'm curious to hear from others what ideas there are about how we can, and it's probably going to be a slow process, but how we can start to put these ideas into place and start to change some opinions, or at least get people on board with the idea that our group is going to be different than what it is right now.
Yeah, for sure. And this is a little bit of a sneak peek, but I think little things It's all in the little things, because little changes eventually escalate into bigger ones as people get more comfortable. So it's a little bit of a sneak peek to ahead, but start with the little ones.
And I think that's an amazing segue as well to continue the presentation, because we are actually going to talk about that. And we're going to have some folks share examples in the room. So I will go right into there. Examples of how DEI has been implemented into our club. So I'm going to invite Mike Taylor to invite some a little bit more about how DEI is already being practiced in our Rotary clubs.
Thanks, Vic. Maybe before we jump off there, I think Tim had a quick question.
My apologies. Go ahead, Tim.
All right, no, I was just going to add, you know, Niagara Central Rotary has three high schools within its purview or its zones, and two of the high schools have interact clubs. And I know that there's a community college that has a Rotaract club, and I think that's one of the mainstays of helping with that generational gap or that uncomfortableness with this conversation sometimes is getting young people just involved. They're not uncomfortable having this conversation. They're very willing to join in committees and further this conversation. I'm currently a superintendent of a school district, former high school principal, so DEI has been around for a good long time. And you know, anytime I find myself in, you know, just feeling uncomfortable, having those, you know, just hesitating to have a conversation with somebody, the kids in the school will have no problem having this conversation with any generation.
Kids are more uncomfortable trying to understand why we can't figure this out.
And I think that when you know, up until today, I've always used as one of my four cornerstones being empathetic and putting myself in other people's places before I made any kind of a decision, before I made any kind of a statement. And I think today, you know, it kind of changed my thought process a little bit around not just being empathetic, but being an ally. And I think that that's an important, you know, step, is that there's adults out there that can handle the conversation and, more importantly, exist in the conversation. There's some of us that can put ourselves in other people's place and be empathetical, but I think, as you know, my generation and older, we need to be allies of everyone, and that's why that's how we can, I think, move forward with inclusion, is understanding that if we're somebody's ally, then we are asking them to the dance. I like that quote too, so I stole it.
You're welcome to. And it's exciting to hear that. Again, if you have any questions at any point, give us a message or anything like that. And yeah, we look forward to moving forwards with this and seeing how everything goes with everyone.
I second everything Lorene said, and thank you so much, Tim, for kind of starting off this conversation about how DEI has been implemented into our clubs. And I think that's something they're very passionate about. I know a lot of our Rotaract members are very passionate about DEI and would be more than happy to come to Rotary clubs and speak with members about it and just start that conversation. And I think sometimes the best way to share knowledge and educate and kind of start to unpack some of these you know, attitudes and beliefs is really just to talk, you know, just to open up those lines of dialogue and allow everyone to share their perspectives and also be open to learning each other's perspectives. So yeah, with that, I invite Mike to introduce a guest speaker for us.
Thanks. Our guest speaker is familiar to us. It's Sue Cerny from the Buffalo Sunrise Rotary Club. Buffalo Sunrise in our district, 7090, is probably one of the most diverse clubs in our district, and have a couple of great examples of some of the efforts that they've undertaken to make sure that Rotary in their community is as inclusive as it needs to be. I think the usefulness in a lot of these discussions and the context of what Sue will talk about is that Rotary has recently really taken a very nice step forward and taken a far more assertive approach to establishing the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the framework of what we are doing. And more, I think we will see this build out and and the resources and assets that'll help us as clubs and as members within those clubs really get our heads into and around all of these concepts and issues. So Sue, thanks for your time, and let's hear about it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So my name is Susan Cerny. I am a member of the Buffalo Sunrise Rotary Club, or Rotary Club of Buffalo Sunrise, to be proper. The Buffalo Sunrise Club is diverse as a club in itself, but several key members have relationships with other members of our community outside of our immediate area. So we formed what is called a satellite club, and we have our East Side Satellite Club. Now, this didn't just happen overnight. There was a few people who put a lot of energy and resources into having discussions with these members, talking about how to form the club, providing mentoring and coaching and support. As a result, our East Side Satellite Club was just formally chartered just over a month ago. They have 8 members. You need 8 members to have a satellite club. So they are their members are part of our club, and we continue to support and help mentor them through the process. We are working on another satellite club. We have another neighborhood called the West Side of Buffalo. And again, we have key members of our club who have relationships with members in these communities, and we're actively engaged in discussing with them the benefits of Rotary, how they can be part of our club, what a satellite club is, and making them feel welcome at our meetings. So they are invited to all of our meetings. We are invited to their meetings, and we all get together socially when we can to connect in person. So essentially, it was the work of key members in our Rotary Club who have strong relationships in these other communities who made these satellite clubs happen. And with that, I'll take any questions about the satellite clubs or anything else.
So maybe before we get to any questions, just to clarify, when you refer to the different communities, you're referring to cultural represented communities, right?
Yes. So our East Side community is primarily African American. Our West Side community is primarily Hispanic. So those are the relationships with club members who have strong relationships in those communities, and we were fortunate to be able to form our East Side Satellite Club, and now we are actively working on the West Side. Correct.
So Sue, the key to this whole thing is having members that are already connected with a specific group or the community efforts. Now, what happens if you're like our club that doesn't have somebody? Now, we have a connection with our indigenous community because one of our members is Métis, but we don't have any Muslims, we don't have any Asians, we don't have any, and so how do you draw them in?
So my recommendation to clubs who struggle with that is to get out into the community and have some events in those communities and invite those individuals in those communities to those events and maybe have them present as a guest speaker. So you have to get outside of your comfort zone. You have to get outside of what your club normally does. And it's easy to book a venue and put out a sign and reach out to that community and invite them to a meeting. And that's how I think you can get started.
Yeah. So the speaker is probably the easiest way to start with, and then once you get that contact, you bridge on from there.
Right. So I will say it took. This was not this did not happen overnight. This was a very long-term process with a lot of discussions, a lot of coaching, a lot of mentoring, a lot of meetings, and there were key people in our Sunrise Club. 2 or 3 key people who wanted to make this happen. It was through their efforts that we were able to establish a satellite club, and now working on the second one.
Okay. Now, our satellite club is helping us with the ageism part of all this diversity, but they're just young white people like us.
Right.
And I would also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Victoria. I'm done.
I was just going to say, I would also add that just be mindful that if you are inviting guest speakers, which is a really great practice to have, especially if you don't have that representation already present in your club, just make sure that we're doing it in an ethical manner, meaning that we're paying those individuals for their time. We're not just asking them to volunteer their time to educate us. And we're also creating a welcoming space and an inclusive space for those individuals. So for instance, if we're inviting an Indigenous elder to speak at our club, we're asking them, you know, what can we do to welcome you into our club? You know, making sure we're doing a land acknowledgement, making sure that we're providing that individual with a form of payment at their request, and, you know, refreshments, all of these things. And another way that we can also kind of begin to welcome communities is connecting through younger folks. So connecting with Rotaract clubs, connecting with Rotaract members. I know that a lot of Rotaract members do have connections in these communities or are part of these communities already. And also just being mindful of your club, you know, being inclusive, right? So celebrating Lunar New Year, or, you know, celebrating or acknowledging that Ramadan is happening. And for example, if you would like to welcome Muslim folks into your club, being mindful that during Ramadan, these folks cannot eat during a certain period in the day. They can't eat or drink anything. So if you're having meetings over dinner, over lunch, over breakfast, those folks cannot participate in those meetings because they're not able to eat or drink during those times. So just kind of really being, you know, mindful of how we can continue to educate ourselves, to learn more about the communities that we're interested in inviting and we're interested in having be part of our clubs, and then ways that we can kind of be inclusive to those communities. I see that Avery also has her hand raised.
And that's just so we can clarify that's Lisa. Lisa Avery.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's quite all right, because our district governor elect is Lisa Bishop. And so the people are always talking about Lisa, and Lisa's doing this and Lisa's doing that. And for the first few meetings, I was very scared that I had not completed anything I was supposed to get done. And so I said, for the next couple of years, I'm just going to go by Avery, and that will make it easier for everyone. But anyway, so my question is, and I would like to acknowledge that you said this was a safe space at the beginning, and so I don't want to get in trouble for anything that I'm saying. In my area, we have a Rotaract club that seems to be, it was started by one of the other clubs in our area, and there seems to be quite a bit of kind of connection between that Rotary club and that Rotaract club. And when you talk about things to do with the Rotaract club, I'd love to reach out to them, but I feel like I'd be stepping on the toes of the club that started this Rotaract club. So how do you suggest a non-support, or not non-supporting, like I'm not in the club that generated the Rotaract club. How do I reach out to them without getting into trouble with other Rotary clubs?
I think from, in my experience working with the Rotaract community, there is no objection from the Rotaractors. They don't look at the club boundaries the same way we do. Rotaractors define themselves as Rotaractors. They are rooted in clubs, but they are a community more broadly. That this group here comes from a mosaic of, you know, one of the participants in this room right now is on a phone in Colorado participating with us today. So they don't look at them the same way. Naturally, you know, our club, Fonthill, Niagara Falls, the Days Club, and the St. Catharines Club, all three of us sponsor the Niagara Rotaract Club. And so I'd simply say, Lisa, you know, reach out to the Rotaract Club, feel confident in it, in dealing with them, but simultaneously reach out to the other Rotary Club. And just give them a heads up. Hey, listen, this is something we want to do. This is blah, blah, blah. Who knows, maybe it could become a joint club initiative and something that the Rotaractors can support both of you at the same time. But if I were the other club, I would certainly not take any offense to another Rotary club taking advantage of an asset that we have available in the Rotary family.
Thank you.
Lorraine, do you have a question? Oh, Mike and I are on sync there.
Sorry, I had to figure out how to lower the hand thing. No, it was more so just to kind of help top off and like with some kind of support for the two questions we had. Regarding inviting members from different races and ethnical groups into your clubs, just make sure that you do a little bit of research ahead of time about that culture or that religion or that race. And like if they can eat the same foods as you and things like that before you invite them to lunch meetings and such, because sometimes they have different diets than us. So we just have to be mindful of that. And as for the second question there about getting involved with Rotaract, absolutely, like feel free to, like everyone was saying, Rotaract is separate from Rotary. We work with Rotary, but we identify as our own community. So feel free to reach out to us. And if you're uncomfortable reaching out to us directly alone, like Mike was saying, reach out to both the Rotary Club you want to be in contact with, as well as the other Rotary Club that is partnered with the Rotaract Club at the same time, and see if it's okay if you guys joined in on a meeting or something with them, and just start from there, little by little. So.
Thank you, Lorraine. I think that context is super, super important. And just because we only have about 5 minutes left, I'm just going to continue on to the final slides in the slideshow. And we will pause at the end for any final comments or questions, should we have the time to do so. So what we've kind of been talking about for the last few minutes, we do have a slide on it, thankfully. This is how to implement diversity, equity, and inclusion into your clubs. These are a few kind of overarching points that are guiding principles that you might be able to use to support you in doing so. So Mike shared with me a post by Evan Burrell about Rotary's new DEI Code of Conduct. So that's what you see on the right-hand side over here. So the DEI Code of Conduct for clubs is something that you can actually implement into your Rotary club. So this can be shared with your local clubs, and we can kind of use it as like a guide or a group agreement for all of the meetings that we have. So this includes using respectful language. That can include the use of pronouns. So that can include, you know, if somebody identifies as she, they, or they, them, being respectful and affirming that person's pronouns, being supportive of one another. So just as we've done and exemplified in this group here, being supportive of everybody's learning journeys. So, you know, encouraging folks to ask questions and also trying to answer those questions and be supportive as we kind of move through these learning journeys. Fostering a welcoming and inclusive environment. So we just kind of shared some ways and suggestions on how to do that, and also celebrating diversity. So if we look to the left here with the 4 points, we've got establishing a DEI champion or committee within your local clubs. So something that we really think is important is identifying a member or a couple of members that can act as a DEI representative or champion within your local club. So these members would be responsible for ensuring that DEI is implemented in clubs and is a priority to your local club. Second would be continuing to engage and learn about these topics. So that's something that you can do by being here today. So we thank you all for starting that process, and as well as kind of checking out some of the links and resources we've shared and reaching out to members in your community and your local Rotaract clubs to kind of continue on this learning journey. Thirdly, we're going to find some community partners and leaders that we might be able to collaborate with. And lastly, completing the Rotary International DEI modules, and the link to these modules is at the end of the presentation in our resources. So I will hand it off to, I believe, Ronnie to discuss some aftercare with us.
So aftercare is an important and an essential aspect of engaging in this type of learning. Engaging with issues around and learning about DEI can be uncomfortable, and it can be mentally and emotionally taxing. It is okay to feel these things in our learning journeys, and as we process this information, you might also experience some discomfort. That's also completely normal and okay. It is important to take the time to check in with how you're feeling and to validate this by selecting something that you can do to care for yourself in the way that you might identify that you need. Given that DEI is an essential part of Rotary and our world, it's important to be able to process and work through these emotions to continue to re-engage with them. So after the training today, check in with yourself, see how you're feeling, and what's one thing that you can do for yourself after this training that would help any potential discomfort or anything like that, help you relax a little bit.
Okay, so I'm just going to finish off here by saying thank you so much for everyone that participated today and attended. We appreciate you taking the time to engage with us this morning and looking forward to the DEI work happening in our district and moving forwards with that. Okay, thank you so much.
Soph?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add quickly, now that we all know about pronouns, maybe before everyone leaves, just go ahead and like
put them in your username before you go back into the main meeting.
I think your audio cut out for a moment there, so I'm just going to repeat what you said. Sophia suggested that we all rename ourselves using our pronouns. So as you can see, Sophia and myself have our pronouns in our name, as well as Mike and Ronnie and Rebecca and Sue. And then just to wrap up as well, I'm going to share the resources slide. So again, you will be receiving a copy of the slideshow and you will be able to click these links. What we've done is we have organized resources under various topics so that they're really easy for you to kind of identify what you'd like to learn a little bit more about and then decide on the links that you'd like to explore. So over here, we've got Indigenous peoples, pronouns, gender identity, sexual orientation, sexism, ageism, racism, accessibility. There were some topics we weren't able to cover today, just given our time constraints. For instance, religion, accessibility, persons with disabilities, intersectionality, you know, these are all really important topics, but again, given our time constraints, we weren't able to talk about them today, which is why we also encourage our further learning. And then lastly, we have Rotary specific resources. So these are very essential and important as you kind of work to implement DEI into your clubs. This can be a really helpful resource for you to take a look at. So we've got the district land acknowledgement. So it provides a little bit more context and information around this. And then we also have 4 points on how you can kind of access more about DEI and Rotary specifically. So we've got the commitment statement, we've got the DEI courses that are available. There's actually an entire webpage dedicated to DEI that goes over, you know, what Rotary is already doing, what DEI looks like in Rotary right now, different terminology and definitions for this terminology. And then we also have a link for the club and district support representative if you'd like to reach out to folks for some support in implementing DEI in your clubs. So yeah, I would just like to reiterate on behalf of all of our presenters today, a thank you for engaging with us and being present at the session today. We will keep the room open for a little bit. I do know that we are 2 minutes over time now. So if folks do want to head out and take a break, we completely understand. But if you do want to stay in the room and you have some comments or questions you'd like to share with us, please feel free to do that as well.
I would just